Community Talkies is the coming together of artists, scholars, explorers who want to be in conversation with the latest in the world of ideas. These conversations are designed to be accessible, intelligible, invigorating, and fun for anyone interested in the humanities and social sciences. Community Talkies is the official podcast of the Manipal Centre for Humanities located in coastal Karnataka, India. Welcome and happy listening.
Welcome, Madhavi Menon. It's a great pleasure to have you with us on the show. Let me briefly introduce you to our audience here. Madhavi Menon is Professor of English at Ashoka University and writes on desire and queer theory. She is the author of The Law of Desire, Rulings on Sex and Sexuality in India, Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India, Wanton Words, Rhetoric and Sexuality in English Renaissance Drama, Unhistorical Shakespeare, Queer Theory in Shakespearean Literature and Film, and Indifference to Difference on Queer Universalism. She is also the editor of Shakespeare, a queer companion to the complete works of Shakespeare. So welcome, Madhavi.
Thank you so much, Ketaki. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. Today we're primarily going to discuss your two latest books, A History of Desire in India and The Law of Desire, Rulings on Sex and Sexuality in India.
Great.
So I'm going to start with the most obvious question, that these two books are written in an accessible, what we would call narrative non-fiction, in a manner, in a style which we are not too familiar with in normative standard academia. So what led you to write this in this manner? Like, what was the decision behind it, in the thought process, and what was the reception in the academic and non-academic world to this style of writing?
Yeah, I've always had, I think, a slightly non-academic style of writing, if by that we mean something that's much more sort of urgent and colloquial. And I think I've always had that style of writing. Some people would call it polemical. So even in my hardcore academic writing, I'm always sort of invested in the stakes of a particular argument, in the consequences of a particular idea. So I've always had that strain to my writing. But certainly these two books mark my writing post moving back to India after being in the US for quite a long time. And I think one of the things that must also have affected that decision then was the re-realization, this was not the first time I was realizing it, but the re-realization that there is a very strong, big, interesting, exciting public audience to discuss these questions, or for discussions of these questions. And so, you know what academic writing is like. It's read by 4 people, of whom 3 belong to your family, if they're being nice to you. But with this kind of what's called crossover writing by the publishers, you have the chance of reaching a much wider audience, for better and for worse. So I think I was very keen to tap into that kind of public conversation. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the Indian intellectual milieu, is that it is not necessarily siloed into academic and non-academic. I think, for instance, a lot of lawyers read what a lot of academics are writing, a lot of activists provide material for a lot of academics, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a much more organic ecosystem here intellectually. And so I wanted to sort of write for that ecosystem, rather than just have, even if my style of writing wasn't that different, to have it branded as an academic book for me was not what I was interested in doing. And as I said, for better and for worse. For better, because I think I've reached many, many, many more people. For worse, because given the political moment that we're inhabiting, the historical moment that we're inhabiting, it leaves me more vulnerable to attacks from certain quarters, from people who don't necessarily like what I'm saying. And so that has not been particularly nice, but if that's the price to pay so far, it's been manageable, and let's hope it doesn't get any worse.
Let's hope not. And to more crossover writings, not from you, but for everybody. That's because right. I feel that this is more easily accessible to students as well within the classroom. And I had taught a history of desire last year in the classroom in a course on identity and society, and I think that really spoke to the students.
Right.
So definitely this is something that works for us as pedagogically as well.
I think that's right, Ketki, because especially, and this is not an India only phenomenon, it's worldwide, the sort of denuding of the humanities, the sort of push back against anything non-technical, non-STEM subjects. We need to be able to not necessarily prove, because I don't think we owe anybody any answers, but we need to be able to demonstrate how vital humanistic thinking is for the world at large and for the life that we live. And so if we're actually talking about issues that affect us on an everyday basis, I think people automatically say, oh, that's not what I'm getting in my engineering degree, or it's not what I'm getting in my, even in my economics degree. So there's a way in which we need to be able to own the strengths we have and showcase them to the best of our ability. I don't think we're inventing it or sort of making it up, but we need to sort of say, this is why we are important and relevant.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And to go on to some of the to the book History of Desire and some of the ideas that struck me. To just sum it up for our audience here, what I really enjoyed was the way you are looking that desire cannot be held in categories, it cannot be held in identities, it spills over, it's sometimes unknown, it's sometimes unknowable, sometimes it goes in directions which are unpredictable, and that is most fruitful. But what was most striking to me in the study of the, even the history of, even the law of desire, was that you were talking, especially in the Infinite Varieties, you had a chapter on celibacy. Because for me that was interesting, primarily because here you are either reworking or expanding the definition of desire itself beyond romance and sex, right? So for me that was fascinating. Along with that, you have also en passant mentioned, spoken, discussed friendship, right? There are certain chapters, there's a chapter on suicide where you have a couple of paragraphs on two friends. You have mentioned friendship en passant. Right. I'm just wondering whether, like celibacy, you have written a chapter, whether if you had written a chapter, an essay, or maybe a book on, let's say, friendship and desire, or friendship as desire, what would that be?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. The celibacy chapter, what is interesting to me about it, because every day almost my students come up with new identitarian terms that I've never heard of, right? So there's always sort of, and Professor, what is the latest one I heard? Sapiosexual.
Yes.
Like, what about like, what the hell does that mean? Anyway, so I'm always sort of playing the old curmudgeon to their young naivete. But one of the things one of the terms that one hears very often these days is asexual.
Yes.
And I find that very interesting as a concept. But for me, that term, I mean, not that any term is accurate, but for me, that term is not necessarily accurate if it suggests an outside to desire, because I think asexuality is also in relation to desire. It can be in a different kind of relation, and that's absolutely fine, but it is in relation to it, and that's how I thought about celibacy as well. So celibacy is not the opposite of sexuality. It's not about asexuality in that sense of the term. It very much is a relation to sexuality that might not be understood commonly as desire, which of course is where it comes into contact with friendship, because friendship is not always understood as being in a relation to that kind of desire. So let me just step back for a minute, Ketaki. I think my entire impetus throughout that book, in fact, in all my work in relation to desire, is really to say that what we think of as desire in terms of romantic investment, genital intercourse, so on and so forth, is really the sort of smallest part of desire. The desire is a far bigger concept that ranges from the clothes we decide to wear in the morning, to the tone of our voice in the afternoon, to whether we go out alone at night, so on and so forth. So it really does affect everything about our lives. So the reason I had some of those chapters in there that seemed counterintuitive, like on celibacy, on mathematics, on film, on the army, things like that, precisely because I wanted to show how vast the canvas is on which desire paints its colors, right? So it's not actually limited to whether or not I want to have sexual intercourse, and that in fact is the least part of it. Which is why friendship is so interesting, right? And you're right that I have mentioned friendship many times in passing without devoting a chapter to it. And in fact, actually, I think the chapter in which I talk about it the most might even be the introduction. When I talk about this entire decade or longer of Bollywood films, in which the sort of primary cathexis, the primary investment is between two men. And even now, when you think about, the relationships among Amitabh Bachchan, Shashi Kapoor, Dharmendra, Rajesh Khanna, and those were the sort of four big ones, you think not of machismo necessarily, even though Amitabh Bachchan is known as the angry young man. You think about these extremely tender, caring, delicate relationships among the men in these films. And the fact that those films might end with heterosexuality, right, might end with the man and with the woman, doesn't in fact detract from the fiber of what's gone beforehand. And I always sort of am interested in this because, for instance, all Shakespeare plays, and I work a lot on Shakespeare, all Shakespeare plays end with heterosexual marriage. But the reason why some of us are interested in the queerness of Shakespeare's narratives is because the end seems almost like a throwaway, completely unimportant. And in fact, thinking about the end as justifying the fabric of the relationship that has come before it is a very teleological way of thinking, right? That the goal will justify everything that's come before it. So if a film ends with a man and a woman, that must mean it's a film about heterosexuality. What's fascinating about these kinds of Dostana films, just as with Shakespeare's plays, is that the fact of heterosexuality at the end does by no means detract from the intensity of same-sex friendship through the text before that. And so for me, that's what's always been fascinating. And I think the Indian subcontinent has a huge advantage over many other cultures in the world, especially in the so-called West, precisely because we have taken same-sex friendships so seriously, or the intensity of same-sex friendships so seriously, that it provides an umbrella for a lot of goings-on that people wouldn't even bat an eyelid at. So and just to give you the most banal examples, you will not have two straight men holding hands anywhere in the West. Here it is so matter of course that it's just incredible, and it's across classes. In fact, the more anglicized, anglophone you get in India, the less likely you are to do this. So in fact, the so-called lower classes are much more in touch with this kind of historical arc that we have inhabited always, where that friendship between men is not necessarily seen as either conforming to or defying heterosexuality. And I think that relationship of friendship to desire is fascinating. And so, if I were to write more about this, I think I would write about film actually, which is what I'm really, really interested in, especially because worldwide people are, oh, Bollywood is sort of cringe-worthy, cringe-inducing. I happen to love it. I'm going to go see Pathan this evening. I think everyone should. I've told my students they'll all get an A the minute they show me their torn ticket stubs for the film. And the reason I'm a huge Shah Rukh fan as well is because he very much is continuing that line of a certain kind of same-sex desire that is not necessarily resolved with heterosexuality.
That's fascinating. I do wonder if you're talking about same-sex friendship, what about cross-sex friendship? Yeah. Ladka ladki dost kabhi nahi ho sakta. I think that's the next question we have to then think about. Yeah. That can we think about a man and a woman in a heteronormative world being friends without there being sex and romance?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I have no idea. And I guess I'm less interested in in male-female relationships, so I haven't thought about that much, but maybe this is something you will do, Ketaki.
Sure. Now coming to your book, The Law of Desire, what struck me again most was the amendment and the notes to the amendment, because in some way it's looking outward, it's looking towards the future, right? And it's also interesting for me because as a scholar of singlehood, as somebody who's questioning marriage, who's questioning the compulsoriness of love, sex, and romance, and primarily coupledom, this chapter, this amendment, even if it's 3 pages, is the shortest that really spoke to me. So, 2 things I want you to kind of maybe discuss. The first is you mentioned this question of marriage for none. And recently, a colleague of mine and me, she's a lawyer, we have been discussing the intersections between law and singlehood. We had a conference, and we've been thinking about what if we had the right not to marry? Yeah. Just the way you have the right to marry, but the right not to marry, not in the way that, let's say, a parent would then exercise the right over, let's say, their children not to marry in terms of outside caste or religion or even same-sex gender.
Right.
But the right to not marry for young people, right, who are forced into marriage or who are forced into, let's say, a marriage within the same caste or religion, right? And you have written about, let's say, in the first chapter on criminality of that case, right? So one is, I'm wondering, how would we go about that? Because that's something that's crossed our minds. It's something that's been written about a little bit in the West. But how would we think that? And the caveat to this question is that I recognize, and you recognize as well in your book, that law and legal reform is not the answer, right? The law and legal reform is not the answer. Law and legal reform works on classification, it works on categories.
Right.
But given that, given that is the case, how would we then think about, since you're talking about marriage for none, the right not to marry?
Right, right. That's great. I'm amazed you had a conference on this. How wonderful. I wish I could have been there. It is, you're right, the amendment part of my book is controversial, to say the least, especially because the case is now in the Supreme Court, the right to marry for same-sex couples. And, many of the people on that case are friends of mine, and, we disagree, but that's neither here nor there. The trouble with marriage, for me, and especially for same-sex marriage, is that in the name of achieving equality or liberation, what we are actually doing is continuing to worship at the altar of a certain kind of heteronormative institution. So to me, that does not seem like liberation. That seems like giving into the status quo and suggesting that this is good enough for you, it must be good enough for me as well. For me, the power, the strength, the edginess of queer politics always lies in the fact of challenging the status quo rather than giving in to it. So for me, the right to, or as it's called, marriage equality, which I think is a big misnomer actually. Marriage equality seems to me a real selling down the river of any kind of queer politics that we've worked so hard to develop. But again, this is not true only of India. As you might remember, the first act after the decriminalization in the US was to apply for same-sex marriage, which is what, has passed. And it's like, really, this is what you want to spend your energy in. Now, there are two, I think, aspects to this, right? One is intellectual, theoretical, political, and on the other hand, logistical or legal. So intellectual, theoretical, political, for me, is what I've said just now, which is that I think queer politics needs to model a sort of different way of doing things rather than wanting to jump on the bandwagon of the same old, same old. And so if you actually want to say, as we should, that everyone needs to be treated equally by the state, marriage is not the way to go around about it. Right? Which takes me to the logistical part, which is that if we want to assert the right of everyone to be treated equally, which I think we absolutely should, all we say then is that the state not, and this is what I've argued, not actually tether rights to the institution of marriage. Right? Because the only reason people want to get married is because they want inheritance, they want property, they, all those rights. And fine, I'm not judging any of that. If you make that separate from marriage, so if, for instance, I'm able to fill out a form tomorrow saying in the event of my death or whatever, all my stuff goes to X, so make a will. Or I have a living document saying in the event of medicalization, so-and-so is the primary caregiver for my case. It's very easy to do that. It's not any easier to get married. So it's not like you're increasing the paperwork or anything of the kind. And then you get, when I suggest this, the reactions are always the same old phobic ones, right? Which is that, well, what if you break up with your partner 2 years later? And it's like, then you fill out a new form. I don't understand what the deal is, right? This is a country that loves its forms, it loves its bureaucracy. But suddenly, when it comes to changing sexual partners or romantic partners, it's like, no, can't do that. And maybe I don't want my romantic partner to inherit my property. Maybe I want my second cousin to get it, right? It should be absolutely my say.
Maybe I want my dog to get it.
Maybe I want my dog to get it. Exactly. So there is a way in which I should get to decide that, but that decision must not be tethered to marriage and must not be tethered to marriage by the state. I mean, that to me seems almost criminal in the discriminatory effects it is producing among citizens of the same country.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you wrote about that and you're saying that right now out aloud in as many words, because that has been something I have been trying to kind of articulate over the last few years, saying that instead of giving same-sex rights to everybody's same-sex marriage, you just give the same rights to everybody.
Exactly.
Because what happened then in the US is that the moment you have same-sex marriage becomes legal, those who are left out are those who are again not married, right?
That's right.
Be it not just straight people but as well, right? So Michael Cobb, who has written about that so we are the new lonely hearts, those who might be queer and single, right?
That's right.
So this is something that we have been arguing for, that how do we do that? And I'm glad that you face the same. I thought I was the only one who faces this kind of pushback.
Every time you want to join a club, you have to remember that the door closes behind you. So there are always going to be people on the outside. Not everyone can be on the inside. So it is by definition an exclusive category.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's what we've been arguing, that instead of, for instance, you mentioned inheritance, medical visits, property ownership, tax exemption, immigration, adoption, instead of saying, and this is something that you mentioned, this is something, because I'm coming from the perspective of singlehood, I'm arguing that you're not talking about a partner anymore. You're talking about anybody else, the way you're saying, right? A second cousin, could be a colleague, could be somebody who's not related by blood, right? Could be a friend. That's why the question of friendship, right? Could be somebody who's not related to me by sex, romance, or blood.
That's right.
Now let's say all of this, right? I leave my inheritance to a friend, and that's not challenged in court by, let's say, a cousin, right? Or my leave, I'm allowed to, let's say, nominate instead of my parents, I'm allowed to nominate, let's say, somebody else. Now, if we go about that, and this is what you call the non-marital mechanisms, and this is something I have gone to lawyers and asked them, like, can we do that? How do we do that? What are the ways in which those who are not married are left out? Are we paying more money if we are not married? So all of those things in the Indian context. But if this happens, right, if those as you say, non-marital mechanisms are put in place, I think that's revolutionary for a number of reasons. One is, what happens to kinship systems? That breaks. What happens to caste structures? Because your marriage, inheritance, property is based on that. It's based on kinship, it's based on caste. It's also based on the neoliberal regime, that if you are entitled, that if I'm the son or daughter of so and so, I'm going to get that. But tomorrow, of course, I mean, we have discussed on how, women are disinherited because their fathers earned money, they can disinherit them in the will, right? But I think this has larger repercussions, this non-marital mechanisms, apart from the fact that, you're giving equal access in terms of medical care, in terms of that. It is kind of questioning the basic social order. So how would you kind of think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why it is revolutionary. One of the strains in queer theory, or one of the ideas in queer theory that many of us are interested in, is this idea of queer kinship, which is not based on bloodlines or genealogy of any kind, that it's based on affective relationships. And so there is a way in which that has the power to mount the kind of challenge you're talking about to this idea of a pure bloodline with all the accoutrement of purity, which is, caste, class, religion, economic background, all that coming together. Queer kinship has a way of putting pressure on all those by talking about affectivities, which is why, of course, queerness is the site of such phobia, because it challenges the sort of cocoon that we built around ourselves without recognizing that it's a cocoon, right? We just think that's the way it is, or the world is. And what queer theory or queer activists say is that, no, this is a cocoon that you have made, and we need to actually figure out the ways in which it's not working. So yes, it absolutely challenges the fundamental unit of society, which is the family. It doesn't necessarily challenge it, though, in all the ways that the fearmongers might sort of come up with, right? So certainly it might throw into question inheritance. So if you're not good to your parents, you might not get anything. But if your parents are, that way inclined anyway, that's that. So there have to be certain, I'm not a lawyer, but there have to be certain stipulations in place. So for instance, if your parents produce a child, they have to be legally made responsible, for instance, let's say for your education. Until a certain age. And then after that, it's entirely up to them whether they want to give you anything or not, but they owe you that much for having brought you into the world, right? So, and all these things, so for instance, even a marital relationship, there has to be a stipulation that in the event of a breakup, there has to be, depending on who's earning more and what the, whatever it is, that there has to be some kind of transfer of money, one time or whatever it is, because of course, usually otherwise the woman who is sort of disinherited. So there is a way in which every one of these issues can be dealt with. I don't see any of these being insurmountable. The fact is we need to have the will to do it. And so without necessarily blowing it out of proportion to say this is going to destroy society as we know it, which is the response to any radical idea, right? Whether it's feminism or whether it's anti-caste politics, whatever it is, this is going to destroy the world as we know it. It's not, unfortunately. It's not going to destroy the world as we know it, and there are many, many ways we can actually ensure that this actually performs maximum justice rather than continuing with the system as it is. So there are ways if we start thinking about it. But thinking is a problem, right? Most people don't want to think, that's the problem.
I say, let's do it.
Yeah, great. Count me in.
I think I'll just come to my kind of last question leading from this is, can we then, since we're talking about friendship and of course legislation, can we legislate friendships?
Tell me more. I don't see how, because, and again, since I'm so anti-categorical, I don't think I want friendship to be yet another category. I want it to be, it's interesting, the friendship is actually never defined, right? We don't necessarily say a friend is X, Y, Z. Whereas, for instance, sexual orientation for us always depends on object of desire. But friendship doesn't actually depend on any one of those fixed givens. And I think it should stay that way, which is why it has the flexibility, I think, to mount the kind of challenge that we want it to mount.
I think that's really interesting. I never thought about how kind of, in that sense, fluid friendship is.
Exactly.
And it's very interesting that what we assume to be fluid is gender identities and sexuality, whereas that has become more fixed and friendship is becoming more fluid.
Exactly.
So maybe that's the future.
That's right.
Go where the flow goes, go with the fluidity.
Exactly. I'd like to live in that world.
Yes, same here. I think with that we will wind up. Thank you so much, Madhavi.
Thank you so much, Ketaki, for having me. It was a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Community Talkies. Please check out more episodes on our playlist and join us again as we continue to explore emerging trends in the humanities and social sciences. This podcast has been created by the Manipal Centre for Humanities. To know more, visit www.manipal.edu/mch.